So, well, welcome everyone to the Revolution 250 podcast. I am Bob Allison, chair of Rev 250's advisory committee, and Rev 250 is an organization of about 70 history groups in and around Massachusetts looking at ways of commemorating the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. And our guest today is Jack Rakove, who is probably the foremost historian of the ideas of this period and the people of this period. So welcome, Jack Rakove.
Happy to be here, Bob. I think Gordon won by dissent here.
Well, I should have said one of the leading scholars in this period. Jack is the William Robertson Co-Professor of American and American Studies Emeritus at Stanford University and a Professor of Political Science by courtesy of law at Stanford. And you taught at Stanford for since about 50 years, which is
ever since the Reagan years, so 40
years. 40 years. Okay, I'm as an historian, I'm not good with numbers. So, and your most recent book is actually about one of the most important results of the American Revolution, which is the idea of religious liberty. Your book, Beyond Belief, Beyond Conscience: The Radical Meaning of the Free Exercise of Religion. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about that before we move on to other topics. So, what is it that's special about the free exercise of religion in terms of the founding generation?
Well, I thought there are two claims that that kind of underlie the subtitle. So the full title, Beyond Belief, Beyond Conscience: the radical significance of the free exercise of religion. The two claims, thinking in constitutional terms, are first that of all the rights we possess, the right to freedom, the free exercise of religion, rights of conscience, represent what I would call the most liberal, in the sense of the most individualistic component of the constitutional rights we claim to possess. Most rights, if you ask how would you compare the free exercise of religion to other rights, I think the argument what most rights actually do is not to exempt you from the authority of the state, but to say that in areas where the state's going to act, it has to conform to certain fixed norms and standards. The idea of, unreasonable search. Mm-hmm. You have reasonable searches, so what's reasonable? The right to counsel presupposes you're involved in, criminal defense and so on and so on. So that's one claim, that there's a kind of radical, I'll use the term liberalism somewhat advisedly here, but in the 19th century sense, John Stuart Mill sense of the term. And the second claim is that there is no other aspect of governance that better illustrates the underlying American theory that the power of government exercises over us rests upon some positive delegation from the people. And the idea that you can take a religion, if you link free exercise with the Establishment Clause, in my view, the two really go together. Modern legal commentators will say there's a tension between them, somewhat peculiar doctrinal reasons. But I think historically, free exercise and disestablishment were actually closely linked and mutually supportive. Nothing better illustrates the idea that the power government exercises, and also the powers that government can be denied exercise, stem from grants or refusals to grant, based on the authority of the people. So those were the two, big constitutional claims. And then what the book tries to do also is to, it was part of a series that Oxford Press has called Unalienable Rights. And I was involved in the planning of that series from the outset, partly because of Madison and Jefferson's interest, and because I take a Madisonian, Jeffersonian approach to the whole subject.
Right.
I claimed that one early on, but I also wanted to use it to ask the question: what is it that makes the United States? I use the term advisedly, but what is it that makes the United States exceptional in its conception of, and which I think is, on the whole, is still the case in its conception of religious freedom. So it's a fun book to write, but like most of my books, it took rather longer than I originally planned.
Right. Well, I know the feeling that you've been more successful at overcoming the hurdles to writing books than some of us have.
Yeah, you keep plugging.
So you have also written a lot about James Madison, who is a fascinating figure. And I think it's your most recent book about Madison was A Politician Thinking, about his creative mind. So what is it that makes Madison creative?
Well, that was the question I was trying to pursue. I thought that's based on a set of lectures I gave in Oklahoma back in as long ago as 2009. And, I thought I'd said, by at that point, I thought I'd said as much about Madison as I had to say, because I've been writing about it, I think about it really since the early 80s. as my doctoral dissertation. But I became a political scientist, right? And I learned a lot from being friends and colleagues with a pretty distinguished group here at Stanford and a few other places. And I started to think about what is the essence of thinking creatively about issues of constitutionalism. There's one particular aspect of this which I've stressed in various places, which is if you think about Madison's approach to federalism, particularly on the eve of the Constitutional Convention, there's a strong game theoretic aspect to it, which if I hadn't hung out with the guys from poli sci, I never would have understood. I never would have grasped it. But once I started inhabiting or trying to inhabit their world, it's like to say I could never pass math camp. The kind of thing, what we asked our grad students to do. Right, yeah. Last time we integrated an equation, LBJ was president. So
yeah.
But from hanging out with these guys, who had an attraction to what's called rational choice theory. I acquired a kind of different, at least access to a different kind of vocabulary, and I realized that while I think Madison was kind of deeply empirical in his thinking. He had a way of taking a step back and trying to draw abstract lessons about it. And there's actually, since you have a Boston hub-based locus here, right? Mm-hmm. There actually Judah Sklar, who was a very distinguished professor of political theory at Harvard, and who I knew as a graduate student by being a tutor in Leverett House. I mean, Sklar has a wonderful remark on Madison about his capacity to kind of look at the turmoil of ordinary events, but be able to take a step back from them and to kind of conceptualize in somewhat more abstract or theorized terms exactly what their significance was. And there's this it's actually item 7 in Madison's vices of the political system of the United States, his pre-convention memorandum. All of a sudden, I saw this in a somewhat new light. It's like, this is, he's thinking in game theoretic terms about the underlying properties of the federal system. So it's kind of questions like that, and then thinking dynamically about how his ideas changed over time. Mm-hmm. Because it's not just he wrote 29 essays for the Federalist, it's that, he remains active in politics for a long time thereafter. So.
Oh, yeah. It is true. I always remember I taught a seminar on Jefferson at the Harvard Extension School, and it was a really eclectic group. And one guy was a longtime Boston politician. Mm-hmm. I remember him saying the thing that all of the historians writing about Jefferson didn't get was he really was a politician. He was really good at this. And I think Madison was as well, but also Madison had a way of looking at this in a more abstract way. He understood the vicious arts of politics, but he also understood the other things that would interest political scientists and still do.
Well, Bobby, it's mattered a lot to my career. I could go pull down the books, but my dad was a well-known political scientist who did two famous books about the first Mayor Daley. It matters a lot to how I think about political life that I grew up in my house. And my dad was not only my father, but this kind of, in a lot of ways, kind of a paradigmatic figure in the study of modern American politics. And in fact, Kevin White once brought him out to Boston in the midst of Kevin White's miseries.
Wow.
He brought my dad out to Boston, and at least when Kevin White's career was heading south politically, my dad met some Boston pals, and he had a great time doing it.
Yeah. Wow. Was it helpful to Kevin White to have? It's a bad sign when you call in the college professors. Now, you did mention, your doctoral dissertation, and I believe your first book, was about the Continental Congress, this really interesting and often overlooked political organization. I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about what brought you to that as a subject to study.
Well, I thought about that recently, and partly in relation to to the death of our yours and mine late mentor, Bud Balin. One day, I think it's my second year in graduate school, Bud, it's having some meeting or something. I was having lunch with Bud, and Bud said something like, "If you could explain what Samuel Adams was up to, you could account for 30% of the revolution." Mm-hmm. I did not yet have the concept of multiple regression, so I didn't know. But I thought 30% is still a pretty impressive number. So I started thinking about that. Adams had not been the subject of great scholarship, but there was a biography actually by my predecessor at Stanford, John C. Miller,
right?
Subtitled "Sam Adams, Pioneer," Propaganda.
Yeah.
I think propaganda is a useless concept for us to apply. So I started to think, maybe kind of going back and looking at Sammy Young's career. Adam spent a long time in the Continental Congress. He was one of the guiding lights in its original organization, and he spent, a number of years of service there. Also, like James Lovell from, the Boston school teacher.
Yeah.
And also, of course, like Madison.
Right.
And so I started thinking about, maybe study, the Continental Congress was a new institution, and maybe looked at how the delegation operated. And then I realized that actually the literature on the Continental Congress was pretty thin. There was a kind of classic narrative history by Edmund Cody Burnett, who did the original 8-volume edition, Letters of Members of the Continental Congress. Didn't have many interpretive motifs. I mean, and then there's a roll call study by a guy named H. James Henderson, which did a kind of roll call analysis of factions within the Continental Congress. I found, for reasons I still think are quite valid. And in fact, I'm reviewing a book that deals with this right now, which is this book, indirectly, The Rise of Majority Rule in Early Modern Britain and its Empire. It has just a little reference to the Continental Congress. It's a great book, though, really interesting book on its last page. Anyhow, I just realized there wasn't the Continental Congress, everybody kind of took it for granted.
Yeah.
No one had really studied it very carefully. So that's what I did.
That's interesting. Yeah, because it is an institution that had not existed before, having this kind of gathering of people from all of the colonies. So there must have been a lot of problems, tensions among these different entities, Massachusetts, Georgia, coming together to kind of create some cohesive body politic. Were they able to do that at all?
Well, I happen to think so. I mean, I didn't like Henderson's emphasis on faction, because I think it missed the fundamental fact that these guys are trying to run a revolution. And everybody expects them to act consensually. And in fact, one of the arguments that this book by this guy Bowman makes is that, before majority rule became the working norm of legislative behavior, he argues it takes place in the House of Commons in the 1640s. The nature of political culture within legislative bodies in the Anglo-American tradition, particularly on the English side, often emphasize consensus, accommodation. It wasn't an issue who has n+1 to get to a majority. And the Congress, I think, on most occasions operated under those assumptions. So treating it as a revolutionary body. And understanding that these guys, none of whom were very few of whom were professional politicians. I mean, Adams, in a sense, was one avant la fête, to use the French, before professional politicians really existed in the modern sense of the term. Madison, I think, became one in his own way. But most of these guys are coming and going, and they're doing it mostly out of a sense of duty, not ambition.
How is it different from the state legislatures? I mean, there was a long experience with legislative assembly. So how is it different than to have this body, which is, to us, it looks similar, but we know it was actually kind of different in its conception?
Well, I think the first aspect I'd stress there, and one that actually has long-term significance, is that I think most political life in the colonial and the revolutionary period, in terms of the activities of individuals, remained essentially avocational in nature. And to some extent, that remained true, I think well into the 19th century. I mean, a lot of people think that the generation of Martin Van Buren, Richard Hofstadter's great book, The Party System, which built upon, I think, Michael Walz's earlier work, the idea when you get to the second party system, people really are starting to become career-oriented politicians.
Right.
But, Nelson Polsby, who's a late colleague of mine out over across the bay at Berkeley, has a famous article in APSR, the American Political Science Review, called, I'm blanking on the title, but it's basically a study of congressional tenure from, over the intercourse history. The basic argument is that, the fact I always say is the mean term of service in the Federal House of Representatives from 1790 to about, the 1890s was 3 years, meaning that, the vast majority of members are serving 1 and 2 terms. They might be pursuing other offices, but I think the concern with re-election, which dominates modern politics, and which I think has become, to use Madisonian language, one of the vices of the political system in the United States. And you really see its sickness in the Republican Party.
Hmm.
You see its effect in both parties, but you really see its sickness. I think in the Republican Party, which has become a corrupt, authoritarian, quasi neo crypto proto fascist.
Well, that's a subject we can debate another day.
I just had to get that line in.
Which party is to blame for this?
But having that conception, you're realizing how different political life was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It was important to me, and it remains important to us. So.
Yeah, good. Okay. Now, a character who does figure in your first book and then in your book on the revolutionaries is John Dickinson, who's kind of craft. So he's an interesting character for a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
Yes. So can you tell us? He's kind of against declaring independence. Then he helps to draft the Articles of Confederation, and
Bob, it's really curious you asked me. I learned from Jane Calvert, who's John Dickinson's keenest, in most entrepreneurial modern student, that Gary Nash, our colleague from UCLA, just died.
Yes.
2 days ago, and she had Gary lined up to do a keynote talk for a conference she's hosting in Philadelphia in October 2022. She wanted somebody to replace him. She asked me if I do it. So I think I think Dickinson is a fascinating character. I love those letters that I think were published back in the 60s. That he wrote back to his parents when he was studying law at the Inns of Court. And I think Jane is probably reprinting them in full in her in volume. So I think Dickinson's a fascinating character for a variety of reasons. I mean, as Jane Calvert makes clear, although he was slightly lapsed from the Quaker community, he married a non-Quaker, which I think is a big deal. Nevertheless, his Quaker ethos ran very strong, and since I had a Quaker education, going to Harvard for college, used to have to go to Quaker meetings, for better or for worse. I understand what that meant. So I think and also Dickinson, I think, was really interesting. He's interesting because he does have this imperial background. He's interesting because he kind of clarifies the American position, through the farmers' letters, which are his great opposition tract against the Townsend duties. He writes the Liberty Song, which was America's greatest revolutionary hit. I tried to get my class to sing it one year. I was the only one who would sing. Because you can actually find that it's sung to the tune of the Hearts of Oak.
Hearts of Oak,
what the tune is.
And, maybe we can sing it. Yes.
Yeah. So he became a celebrity. I mean, Americans don't have too many political celebrities, but Dickinson won. And for that reason, his positions in, once you get to the big crisis from 74, 75, 76, Dickinson is he's an independent actor in his own right. He's conscience stricken in the way that earnest Quakers, the inner light, whether he's an Orthodox Quaker or quasi-lapsed, he's conscience stricken. And his voice matters. And like many moderates, he well into, I think, at least into the spring of 1776, like John Jay, James Duane, Robert Morris, James Wilson, they all hoped that if the British would only send commissioners over, and the commissioners had real instructions to negotiate, you could halt the movement towards independence and actually try to work something out. So I felt it's just, I don't think we've ever given the moderates the credit they deserve. We like I think we like the radicals a bit more. To admire Robert Morris. Not so easy. But I think they were. I mean, they have to agree with because of what I said previously. The emphasis on consensus means they have to they have to work with the radicals, who they think are trying to manipulate things. On the other hand, they are themselves patriots in the capital P. And so they're desperate for reconciliation, but they're resigned to a break because they get so exasperated with the British, and the king and his ministers, and so on.
So you've also just recently published the Cambridge Companion to the Federalist, and the Federalist is the great book that comes out of the ratification debate, but in many ways it's part of an argument. It's an argument among people who had been on the same side about the nature of politics, the creation of a political system. Is this going to be the establishment of tyranny, et cetera? So Do you see then a consistency between the arguments of the ratification debate and the arguments of 1774, 5, and 6? Is there?
It's not. I don't think that's a theme that any of us pushed particularly. I mean, there are a few scholars out there. I think they're mostly conservatives, and many of them I think actually are Straussians.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad took Leo Strauss's seminar, so I'm not a person. And I have Straussian friends. We say Ralph Werner is a good friend of mine. Who do want to see this deep organic link between the Declaration and the Constitution. I don't find that, and I don't think really any of the participants in our symposium, or I should say in our the symposium in the sense of a completed volume, really emphasize that connection.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of it still pivots around the idea of the Madisonian Constitution or Hamilton's essay on judicial review in Federal 78. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of work done by a couple of buddies of mine from NYU Law School, David Golub and Dan Holzenbosch, on the importance of the law of nations. Mm-hmm. Kind of global worldview,
right? Yeah,
the authors of the Federalist. I think the nice thing about the volume is that we recruit my co-editor Colleen Sheehan, who's a political scientist, formerly at Villanova, now at ASU, down in Tempe. We recruited a good group of scholars, and we try to get some ideological diversity. There are people on the right as well as kind of liberal, left-leaning types like myself. We have historians, lawyers, political scientists, and theorists. So I think we had a nice mix of disciplines, and so it's a pretty good volume. In the end, Madison, Madison writes 29 of the essays.
Yeah.
Hamilton wrote 51. Jay wrote 5 or something.
Yeah.
And in the end, Madison, though he writes fewer essays than Hamilton, Madison remains the dominant figure, though whenever you turn to Hamilton, you also find a lot of good stuff.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Is obviously as well. I mean, the idea of these, and like many scholars, I think including actually Bud, I think Bud Balin had somewhat mixed views. I think Bud felt the obsession. There's a modern scholarly obsession with the Federalist, which I think gave it more emphasis, perhaps really deserved. I have a more favorable view. I mean, I happen to think that Madison and Hamilton were really working pretty hard to convey things they felt pretty strongly about into those essays. And, the more, and particularly on the Madison side, the more closely you study them, I think the more powerful that impression remains. So I like to say this is propaganda, which I think is, going back to what I said about John Miller, that's a useless term to apply to 18th century politics. I mean, I take its modern meaning associated with, the Bolsheviks or the Nazis, Mussolini or whatever. That's not, all political argument is an attempt to persuade somebody to say political argument is propaganda. It doesn't do anything helpful for you.
No, it's dismissive of something, and these all are attempts to persuade people and not to. It was struck when Balin and I did a short volume of documents, and we asked you what Federalist essays to include. And you were very helpful, saying, "Well, if you're only going to do one, this one you gave up to 10."
Right.
And what struck me was the most interesting ones that each of us picked out were by Madison, and because he is an interesting thinker as well as being a practical politician. And I'm not quite sure how to account for that. Of course, we missed the boat. We didn't write a musical about Madison, at least not yet. That can be.
Actually, I talked to some guy down here who wants to do one, but
really
haven't heard back from him. Madison it's just too much the life of the mind. You can't. You just can't. It's just a fundamental problem.
Yeah.
And, so you really had to engage with him seriously, as I have now, really for 40 years. I mean, I think you really do have to enter into his political science. It's what I try to do in a sense in the Politician Thinking book. It's not just to describe his own activity. You have to try to view things as he viewed them, and to think about what he was, the novelty. Well, it's true of the whole generation, but as I like to call in revolutionaries, they call him the greatest lawgiver of modernity, which is a pun on John Adams.
Right. Yeah.
Adams says the greatest lawgivers of antiquity would wish they were in our situation.
Yeah.
So.
So where does Madison, how does he get into his ideas on religious liberty, which is one of the striking contributions he made?
I think it comes pretty early. I mean, in
Mhm.
a certain sense, it remains a little mysterious, but it's well documented. I mean, when he comes back from, I mean, it may be partly some of it. I think maybe Witherspoon's
Mhm.
influence on him, though. Witherspoon, of course, was a hardcore Presbyterian who sent to the future Princeton University, the College of New Jersey, in order to kind of
Mhm.
clean the place up or whatever
Yeah.
theologically. But I think the Madison who came back, from Princeton in, I guess, 1771, if I remember correctly,
Mhm.
was I mean, it's really the first issue he takes seriously. You see it in his early correspondence with his friend William Bradford,
Mhm. Mhm.
later became Attorney General. In the 1790s, you see it. When the Boston Tea Party breaks, there's a funny letter where Madison he starts talking about politics. Mary Beth Norton talks about it a bit in her new book on
Mhm.
1774, but then he wants to go on and talk about religious matters. Just kind of,
Mhm. Yeah.
you see in his discussion of the prosecution of the Baptist preachers without license. So it's a position he came to very early, and of course, as I argue in my religious freedom book, the Beyond Conscience book, he and Jefferson first met. I mean, the first time they met was on the Committee on Religion in the Virginia legislature. The first Virginia legislature under the new Constitution that Madison had a modest role in drafting, mostly through the religion article in the
Right.
Declaration of Rights, which was the
Yeah.
parallel document. So the first place they meet and actually, actively start to collaborate was in the Religion Committee, because because of the Religious Freedom article, was getting all these petitions calling
Mhm.
for the disestablishment of the Church of England. They had to figure out exactly how to respond to that kind of
Yeah.
liberal impulse arising from from the dissenting groups. So he came to it early, and I think it continued to inform his political thinking for the rest of his life. And the book,
Mhm.
the Religious Freedom book, actually begins with a kind of later Madison comment about what is it the Americans are demonstrating for the other peoples of the world about about the nature of religious freedom. So it's just it's like I do remember the 1960s. I was
Yeah.
there, and I do remember them.
Okay.
But I'm not sure how much of the product of the 1960s I am. But in this sense, Madison really was in this commitment. I think he was a product of his collegiate education and his experience in politics afterwards.
Mhm.
Reconfirmed his initial values.
Yeah. Yeah.
The other thing about it that's worth mentioning is, I'm a great skeptic, but we don't know much about his theology. With Jefferson, we do.
Yeah.
Buckley, there's a great collection on the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, where I think it's
Yeah.
John Buckley, who I think is a member of the Society of Jesus,
Mhm.
has a great essay on Jefferson's theology. Madison, I think, went completely private
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
religious beliefs, which would be consistent with his public philosophy, but leaves us, scratching our heads a bit. As did
Yeah.
you remain a Christian? I mean, would he have been a Socinian the way I think Jefferson
Mhm.
was?
Yeah. Yeah.
I like the Socinians because they have something called the Rakovian Catechism, which is not named for the Rakove family, but maybe named for the town where our family, people bearing our name, originated.
Yeah. And he does see later in life that it is the religious freedom that has allowed all these different religious sects,
Right.
denominations, ideas to flourish, whereas with an established religion, you don't have that. So it's
Right. Right.
it's a way of sustaining religious practice, religious belief by taking the state out, I think.
Right.
So,
Yeah. I think I think the difference between him and Jefferson remains striking. I mean, Gordon would like to stress this point, but I think Jefferson is actually kind of quite depressed, or not depressed, but is kind of sobered by the Second Great Awakening and
Mhm.
the reinvigoration of Calvinist, conversionist theology.
Mhm.
Whereas Madison, if I paraphrase Madison, says, "Look, back in the 1780s, you warned us all these terrible things would happen to religion." But in
Yeah.
fact, that's not true. I mean, it's all worked out.
Right.
Maybe it's not all worked out. And today we're wondering, actually today we
Yeah.
have serious concerns as to, what's happened to,
Yeah.
evangelical Christianity. But, that's another couple hundred years of experience.
Yeah. 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 And he also noted that in New England, where there still were established churches, that religion seemed to be on the decline, whereas in Virginia, which had the statute, it's flourished. So, yeah, he's at least in one aspect looking back and saying, we were right, things worked out, which
Right.
I guess is more than most of us can do. Many of us can do.
He took great. Of course, also, I mean, it's an interesting thing about this day. Today when we're so worked up and with good reasons about issues of race, racial prejudice, the whole Project 1619 stuff and so on, which I generally support, though I'm troubled by their position on the revolution. It's important for Americans today to understand that in the 18th century, the concept of race as the critical dividing factor would have been something of a novelty, and it's still something. I mean, when Jefferson writes his notes on State of Virginia, he's way ahead of the curve, I think, in terms of thinking in racially implicit categories. The issue of religion, and it's a theme I stress in my beyond belief.
Right. Yeah.
That was the great dividing point, and I mean, that was a great source of persecution. Maybe because people really haven't focused on the slave trade. I mean, the idea that the slave trade is perceived as being immoral is, many historians think, begins to emerge coherently the midpoint of the 18th century with kind of religious motifs behind it.
Yeah.
But worrying about religion in the way that Jefferson and Madison did was, in a sense, it was the common sense of the period. Worrying about race was a novelty that people were only starting to try to get grips with.
Very interesting. We've been talking with Jack Rakove, retired emeritus William Robertson Co-Professor of History and American Studies at Stanford, and author of a number of books, including Beyond Belief, Beyond Conscience, and A Politician Thinking, The Creative Mind of James Madison, and Revolutionaries, a great book about the generation that brought about the revolution, people with on different points of the political spectrum, though all I think we're on the side of the revolution. And anything else we should talk about, Jack? This has been a great conversation, and
well, I could go on forever, Bob.
So. I know. Well,
we're going to talk about the fate of the republic, whether the Constitution's going to survive. These are the kind of trivial issues that concern me today. But like to say, putting those little quibbles aside.
Yes, we'll have you back to talk about the fate of the republic and whether it will survive. So it's been great talking to you, and now we will be piped out on the road to Boston. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon today.